Michael Jordan was a really influential man, wasn't he? He had kids all around the world saying, I want to be like Mike. And Paul in 1 Corinthians, he writes eerily the same idea, where he says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. You see, Paul is claiming to be this role model that we can follow. And so tonight, what I want to look at is, what is the life of Paul? What are the attributes of Paul? What makes Paul so special that we ought to follow Paul? And so the first point that I want to make is that Paul was zealous. When we read about Paul, the beginning of his story, Paul wasn't Paul, right? He was a completely different guy. He was a zealous Pharisee persecuting all of the Christians. And he was lacking, right? He was persecuting the very body that he would one day join. But the interesting thing about when Jesus chooses you for his will is that it doesn't matter what you're lacking, right? Paul, he was lacking. He was lacking, in his zeal, where he would misplace his zeal. When you think about Jesus feeding the 5,000, he took this little boy who had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And the object of feeding 5,000 people, he was obviously lacking. He didn't have the resources to do it. But Jesus took what he had, because it's not about what he was lacking. It's about what he had. And he had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. So Jesus used that to feed the 5,000. And you take Moses. Moses, he wasn't a great speaker. And he told God this. He's at the burning bush, and God said, I need you to lead my people. And Moses said, God, I don't know what you're talking about, right? I am not a leader. I can't speak. But it's not about what Moses was lacking, was it? It was about what he had. And so you come to Paul, and you look at what Paul has. He has this zeal. And so isn't it interesting that it might be the very thing that Jesus chose him for, his zeal? In Acts 20:24, we read that Paul is uncompromising. He says that he knows that when he gets to Jerusalem, he's going to face trials and tribulations. But then he says, it will not move me. Because Paul is willing to stand up against his enemies. Do we have that zeal where we're willing to stand up against those who threaten us? Then, in Galatians 2:11, he doesn't just stand up to his enemies. He takes Peter, and he rebukes him. He says, Peter isn't doing all what he's supposed to be doing. He doesn't just stand up to his enemies, but he stands up to his friends. And so we have to ask ourselves, why not us? Why might we not have this same zeal as Paul? Is it because of the world? Just read John 15:18, what Jesus says about the world. He's talking to his disciples. One day they're going to have to go out and convert the world. And they have to know, okay, what is the world going to think of me? And so in John 15:18, it reads, if the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but because I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. For any zealous Christian, the world will hate them. The world will hate any zealous Christian. You take Jesus, for example. When Jesus let the sinners touch him, right, touch his garment, what did the Pharisees say? They said, oh, he's letting the filthy touch him. He can't be the Messiah, right? But what would they have said had he not let the sinners touch him? What would they have said? They'd probably say something along the lines of, oh, well, he says he's come down to save the sinners, but he wouldn't even let one touch him, right? And then you read about Jesus eating with sinners and Gentiles, and the Pharisees, they condemned Jesus for this. But what would they have done had he not. They would say, oh, look, he's claiming to be the Messiah, but he's all prideful, he's all haughty, right? He can't be our Messiah. And so the point is, no matter what you do, the world is going to hate you. So our motivation for being a zealous Christian it has to be that we are not concerned with what the world thinks of us, right? In Galatians 1:10, it says that Paul, he seeks to please God. He does not seek to please men. And so after this stage of Paul's life, there's another stage in his life, and where before he was a zealous Jew, and then becomes a zealous Christian. But not only a zealous Christian, but he is a humble Christian, right? In 1 Corinthians 15:8, he calls himself the least of the apostles. And this matches what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 5:21. It might be tempting sometimes for any zealous Christian to say, I am holier than thou. But in verse 21, Jesus says, you have heard it said that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. So what Jesus is, what he's not saying here is he's not saying, he's not giving you ammunition to spray all over the sinner. So, oh, you murder and you hate? Oh, you must be beneath me, right? That's not what he's saying. He's saying that he's bringing down the prideful, not bringing down the sinful. And so you see here that Jesus' ministry is all about humility, right? That movie Aladdin, when, Aladdin, he comes into the city, he has 75 golden camels, and peacocks, he has 53. And then you contrast that. You can juxtapose that with Jesus' triumphant entry. When Jesus entered into Jerusalem, what do you have? You have one donkey. Because his ministry is all about humility. And you see that exactly exemplified with Paul, right? In the letters to the Corinthians, Paul is criticized for being too humble. His enemies, they'll say, he can't be an apostle. He can't be an apostle of the great Lord because he's so lowly. He's so humble. He could not be an apostle. And so you see it exemplified through Paul's ministry. He claims to be the least of the apostles. Yet there's one question that bugged me. How can Paul be the least of the apostles yet boast, right? How can he be humble yet content? Because let's define humility and contentment. What is humility? Humility is when you're at a sort of level plane, and then you realize, okay, everyone's better than me, and I'm not as good as everyone else. And then contentment is when you say, you look at someone who's greater than you, and you sort of ignore their status, and you say, okay, well, I'm level. And so you have these two sort of seemingly paradoxical ideas. And I've always kind of wondered, how do you balance it? How do you balance humility and contentment? Because that's what Paul seems to do. He has both of these qualities. But Paul answers this question in the letter to the Philippians. He writes that he has the peace that passes all understanding. Yeah, he doesn't say that he has it from his own works, something that he's done, right? See, the answer to the question, the answer to the paradox is to say that instead of relying on your own accomplishments and saying, I'm content with my own accomplishments, rather, you should say, I'm content with Christ's accomplishments. And that's the next point I want to make. Paul is content with Christ's accomplishments as he is faithful. He's dependent on Christ. First, I want to define what faith is. Faith is not simply a belief in God, right? Faith is a knowledge that God exists, right? But it's also the trust that he's going to do what he says he's going to do. And it's also the action. There's action that necessarily follows from faith. Think of a trust fall, right? You put your arms on your shoulders and you sort of fall over. If you were to just say, oh, well, I acknowledge the existence of the guy behind me, is that enough? Can you do that? No. What a trust fall is when you put your arms on your shoulder and you acknowledge the existence of the man behind you and you say, well, I trust him. I trust he's going to catch me. and then you go about your day. You don't fall or anything, right? That's not what faith is. It's not just a knowledge. It's not just a trust, but it's an action, right? There's the action of falling into the other man, right? And when you think of Peter, right, he's walking on the water, and Jesus rebukes him because he falls. So Jesus rebukes him and says, "O ye of little faith." What is Jesus saying? Is he trying to say, "O ye of little acknowledgement to my role as the Messiah"? No, obviously not, right? I mean, he already knows Jesus is the Messiah. He says so in Luke 5. So that's not what he's saying. What Jesus is saying, "O ye of little faith," as in, "O ye of little trust." It's not just a knowledge, but it's a trust. And it's not just a trust, but it's an action. Read James 2, where James, he makes this analogy where he's talking about how there are, when you're being generous, you have to give, right? Generosity, by its very nature, requires a substance. And so his point in James 2 is he's trying to say that faith, by its very nature, also requires a substance. So flip with me to James 2. James 2, starting in verse 15, it says, "If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Depart in peace, be warmed and filled,' but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? This also, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead." So we see that faith is not only a knowledge, but it's a trust and an action. So how in the world does this all relate to Paul, right? Well, in Acts 27, right, there's this next stage of Paul's life. First he was the zealous Jew, and now he's the humble Christian, and now we're getting to the point where Saul is in prison. And at this point, he's appealed to Caesar, and he's on this voyage to Rome. And he's on the ship with a whole bunch of other prisoners and the centurion, and lo and behold, a storm comes along, and they're all in danger now. And when we read these sorts of stories, we read it a little platonically. We see, okay, this happens, and then this happens, and you flip the page, and then this happens. But to them, that's not how it was going down. To them, they had to wait weeks out in this storm, right? So it comes to the point where the prisoners, they're losing all hope. They don't know what to do. And Paul, he gets this vision from an angel of God, and the angel tells him that God will save him. God will deliver him via shipwreck. That's an important detail. He's going to save him with a shipwreck. And so what ends up happening, he tells the prisoners, and okay, now they have a little bit of hope, but not much. They're still a little skeptical. And so, sure enough, at some point the sailors, they find land, and they see, okay, all we'd have to do to live this situation, we just got to jump out the boat and swim to safety, right? So they're saved now, right? Well, that's not what Paul says. Paul, he says, no, we can't swim to safety, because God didn't say I was going to be saved by swimming to safety. He said I'm going to be saved by a shipwreck. So he says we can't leave now. And so here, not only does Paul have the knowledge, right? The angel comes to him and gives him the knowledge. Not only does he have the knowledge, but he has the trust. So he's exemplifying his trust here by passing up on his way on getting out of the situation, passing out on man's opportunity to escape, and using God's opportunity to escape. And then you have that third part of faith, action. So eventually, all the meanwhile, these prisoners, they're rationing out their food. They don't have a lot of food, and they're starving at this point. They haven't eaten in 2 weeks because they don't know when they're going to get out of this storm. They don't know when they're going to get out of this ship. But Paul knows. So he sits down and he has a meal. And the prisoner's like, wait, what are you doing? You're eating up all our food. And Paul says, guys, don't worry. my God is going to save us. So he takes this action here. He knows he's going to be saved, and he's taking this action. And now he's eating the food. And sure enough, all the prisoners, they start to eat food too. And eventually they're saved by shipwreck. They shipwreck into an island and they're saved. But something interesting is going on under all of the while, right? All of the prisoners ate food when Peter said, well, not Peter, when Paul said to eat the food. Why would they listen to him? When Paul said, hey guys, let's not jump off the ship. My God didn't say to do that. They all listened to him. Isn't that a little strange? Well, in reality, our faith can be a testimony. And that's what Paul's proving here. Your faith can be a testimony. You can be the light of the world. And that's exactly what Connor's going to preach in a minute.